Dr. Paul Mason, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Really good to have you here, man. We've been trying to do this for a while on the back of your colleague, Daron, who everyone's loved, and it's been listened to many, many times. I want to start just a little bit of background about you, where you did your study, metabolic medicine in general, and, just what's happening in the field.
Well, I guess the key defining thing for me is I'm a sports and exercise medicine physician. So I spend my days with athletes, and as you know, for athletes, body weight and performance is a key consideration. And as it so turned out, that's gradually evolved into dealing with more and more members of the general public. And for me personally, I used to have metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is a condition if you tick 3 boxes out of 5. That includes central adiposity, low HDL, high triglycerides, high blood sugar levels, high blood pressure, then you have metabolic syndrome. And I was in my 30s and I had metabolic syndrome. And as you know, most doctors are a bit OCD, a bit type A. So I followed to a T the advice that I was told. I counted the milligrams of sodium that I was having on a daily basis. I made sure I had a low-fat diet. I did not care about the carbohydrates nor the sugar because we were told that was okay. So
food pyramid.
I had massive amounts of carbs and sugar.
Yeah.
I was exercising every day. I would ride my bike to and from, wherever, if I was working or studying, I'd be exercising for at least an hour, hour and a half every day. And still I developed metabolic syndrome. And so I guess there was a bit of a personal journey in there, and then it morphed into a professional interest.
Yep. So you did your undergrad study at Sydney University?
Yeah. Well, I've got 3 degrees. So I started out doing physiotherapy down in Melbourne.
Yeah.
Then I did my medical degree at University of Sydney, and after I did that, then I followed that up with a master's degree in occupational health.
Interesting.
And then I've sort of morphed off into just doing, I guess, private study or personal study on ketogenic diets, low-carb diets, nutrition, health in general.
Metabolic medicine, it seems to be a bit of a new area of specialty. What actually is it? Obviously, it's dealing with people's metabolic health, but for those that don't understand that, like, how do you diagnose whether you've got metabolic syndrome? How do you diagnose whether you've got a healthy metabolic system? Give us a little bit of insight to the field of medicine.
Well, I think in a nutshell, metabolic syndrome comes down to insulin, which is a hormone in the body. And as I mentioned earlier, there's 5 diagnostic features in what we term metabolic syndrome. And each one of those 5 is caused by something called insulin resistance, which is basically high levels of insulin. And that's been proven in multitudes of papers. Biochemically, it's been mapped out. We know how it happens, we know why it happens, and we've proven that it does happen. So metabolic ill health is a consequence of insulin resistance. And then if you want to take it one step further, what's the biggest cause in the population for insulin resistance? It's dietary carbohydrate.
And yet that's what we were taught to eat for a long, long time.
That's what I was taught to eat. So I studied physiotherapy in the 90s. And so what did I do when I got out? Well, we were taught the food pyramid. So, I used to advocate that. And when I went back to med school, what did we get taught? Carbs are good. Carbs are good. And yet,
if any, my understanding of how much nutrition study is done in a medical degree is deplorably low.
Yes. So I believe we had 1 hour of nutrition. I couldn't actually recall what was in that 1 hour lecture. But given that in my practice, I have quite a holistic practice, and I see a lot of people for a lot of different conditions. And I'd say attention to nutrition probably forms 50, 60, possibly more of my practice. So the formal teaching I've had is totally disproportionate with how important it is.
One of these amazing new age doctors that instead of writing a prescription actually write you some dietary framework, perhaps.
Well, exactly. So we prescribe dietary advice, and I probably just to reflect on your comment on writing a prescription, In medical school, we're taught how to write prescriptions. We're taught, here's what drug you use for what condition. This is the starting dose. If that's not effective, you increase it to this. We know this very well. What we're not taught, and what was one of the biggest conceptual challenges for me when I first started practicing medicine like this, is deprescribing, taking people off medications. So if we take somebody, as I said, high blood pressure is one of the features of metabolic syndrome, a patient might come in and they might have normal blood pressure, but they might be on 3 different medications designed to lower the blood pressure. So then what happens if we start correcting the underlying cause of their high blood pressure and they're still on these 3 agents? Well, we know what happens. They'll probably faint. They'll feel dizzy. They'll feel lousy because it's like you took a normal person with normal blood pressure and just put them on a bunch of medications to drop their blood pressure. So then the art is well, how do you know which medication to reduce first and how much? If you reduce it too quickly, is that going to cause a problem? It's exactly the same in a diabetic who needs to inject insulin. If I put somebody who's on a standard Australian diet, the SAD diet.
SAD diet, I love that.
And I put them overnight on a strict low-carb diet, then I actually need to reduce their insulin dose in the vicinity of 50%. Otherwise, they'll have what we call a hypoglycemic event, where because of the injected insulin, their blood sugar will go too low. And that could put them in a coma, that could even kill them. So this whole element of deprescribing is actually, it wasn't touched on at all in medical school.
Of course it wasn't. Is surgery and pharmaceuticals are at the heart of the commercial model of medicine.
Yeah, look, I agree with you.
Maybe you're disproving that, but
I probably will defend the medical profession to a degree that
I love the medical profession. I told you that. My mum, my dad, my brother are all doctors, so I have nothing but respect for medicine. But the institution itself seems to be flawed.
The institution is flawed, but I would like to make a distinction that I think a lot of the harm that the medical profession is doing, I think it's more through negligence and not through culpability. Doctors don't set out to harm their patients.
Negligence or ignorance?
Well, I think if you don't educate yourself about the latest science, I would argue that's negligence.
Yeah.
But I don't think they do it deliberately. I think there's a duty of care that we have to stay up to date and informed of the science, and if we don't do that for whatever reason, I think we're failing our obligation to our patients.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I want to talk about the 2 ends of the proverbial spectrum that is getting more airplay, becoming more divisive than any other thing, perhaps other than climate change, which kind of ties into it anyway. But that's the vegans on one end and the carnivores on the other, and have a really objective look at the benefits of, let's talk about red meat because it's probably the most nutritionally dense of all the meats on one end, of what actually is in it and what is potentially dangerous about it, and then on the other end the nutrients that you get being on a vegan diet and the benefits of that and the potential dangers of that.
Yeah.
And I know it's a big ask, but can we just start with that? Let's start with the plants. What's the benefit of being on a vegan diet?
Look, I think the benefit of going to a vegan diet is that you are no longer on the standard Australian diet. You're not on a SAD diet.
Being heavily processed, sugar.
Lots of sugars. Now, the problem with...
But you can have a lot of sugars on a vegan diet. There's a lot of vegans I know that have a lot of sugars and processed
they're very unhealthy.
Yeah.
But the problem is when we do the research doesn't include those sugars. It doesn't include the Tim Tams and the snakes and all these kind of things on the research. So you can pick any diet you want. If you compare it to the very low bar that is a standard Australian diet, it is going to come out superior.
Yeah, of course.
So when people point at the studies and say this diet found this and this study showed this and it's clearly good, it's like, well, what are you comparing it to? And nobody has compared a whole foods animal-based diet with a whole foods vegetarian or vegan diet, or plant-based. So when they're one of the big problems with the research is that when they're looking at what they consider to be red meat, they're actually conflating it with intake of junk food. So a lot of it is
and
done.
all sorts of other confounding factors, yeah?
Well, absolutely. But let's just address this one for the moment. So a lot of the studies are done on food frequency questionnaires, so if I can do, how many milligrams of salt did you have yesterday?
Yeah.
How many eggs have you had in the last 12 months? These things are just
Most people can't remember what they had for breakfast, let
Exactly.
alone, yeah, I get it.
Inherently unruniable.
Yeah.
And then,
just for people's knowledge, is this a typical epidemiological study that they use the framework for?
yes, food frequency questionnaires are a standard instrument involved in nutritional research. And then we might take something like intake. And if somebody's eaten pizza, do you know what food group pizza gets classed as? Red meat.
Yeah, wow.
Because it might have a bit of meat on it.
Yeah.
Now, if you're having a pizza, could you be having a soft drink perhaps at the same time? If you're having a hot dog, are you sort of having, you're not having that with a salad on the side, are you? So there's these confounding variables where the misclassification of foods, the poor recall of foods, and the associated health behaviours, which you alluded to before. Now, we have it's a healthy user bias is what we call it. So if you believe that something is healthy or unhealthy, then that's going to influence your behaviour. If you're the kind of person who takes care of your health and somebody says red meat is bad for you, say, fine, I'll eat less red meat. You're also the kind of person who will probably quit smoking if you're addicted to smoking. You'll exercise because you're told that that's good. You'll try and get enough sleep because you're being told that's useful. So because of this association that red meat, it's been correlated, at least in the public perception, with ill health, a lot of the research is now subject to this healthy user bias. And this is why the epidemiological research, or as some people term it, the epidemiological research, you just can't trust it. And until they come out with a proper experimental design that compares a whole foods animal diet, that means without the soft drinks. That means, it's not red meat on pizza. It's red meat from well-cooked, healthy steak compared to a whole foods plant-based diet. We're not going to have a definitive answer. But if we have a look at things from a biochemical perspective or a nutrient density perspective or any other number of ways, we can clearly see there's benefits in animal foods. There was a paper published a few years ago, and I believe it was sanctioned by the World Health Organization, looking at stunting in different countries across the world.
Stunting, not growing tall.
Retarded growth in children, pathological.
Yeah.
And that actually showed a clear correlation with lack of animal food intake. They did interventional studies. There was one study they did in Ecuador where they actually, a control group, they gave them an egg a day because it's a lot of the reason that animal protein is not consumed across most of the world is nothing to do with attitudes to meat. It's due to its economics and availability. I mean, we're incredibly in the fortunate position where we have the option of having animal products if we don't. Unfortunately, in much of the world, that's not the case. And they're actually able to find that they are able to prevent a lot of this pathological stunting in children just with an egg a day. Now, and they've also done various analyses looking at other animal foods, and basically they found that, red meat, dairy and eggs are absolute winners when it comes to child's health and growth and development. Now, if we were to just stay on this for a moment, the developing brain requires an omega-3 fat called DHA. So I think something like 2/3 of the brain is fat. And of that, this DHA fat, it's an omega-3 fat, is a major, major part of it. And this does not come from animal foods. Perhaps with the potential exception of algae, which is why it's in fish. But we're not eating algae. The animal foods we're eating, the flax seeds, that's got a form of omega-3 that's very poorly bioavailable, and very little, if any, will actually be converted into this DHA, which is a building block for the brain. So there's been lots of research looking at developing children and cognition and brain, and it's a pretty clear picture that if you have this available in the diet, it actually will affect the IQ.
How can I play devil's advocate? Because the study thing is really interesting to me in that you can virtually find research to support whatever argument you want. How do you, like we talked before about some of these epidemiological studies and that there are confounding factors that aren't taken into account. So are you comparing apples with apples and so on and so forth? The studies that you refer to with brain development in children and things, how do people know what studies they can rely on and that it's not just someone that believes in a certain science is finding the studies that support their view, whereas there's probably equal number of studies on the other side of the ledger?
So when you're reading the study, if it says epidemiology or correlation, be very suspicious. So correlation is what happens when we say, look, you pick some random event. Let's say it gets light in here. When you walk into the room, you might have a sense of light, and you say, well, that seems that so walking actually turns the light on. Well, perhaps it is, but it's actually more than that. It's actually, this sensor, and it activates, and it's the electricity running through the wires that actually will lead to the light being there. Yeah. So just because something happens at the same time doesn't mean it's a direct cause of it. So for that matter, we actually want to look for experimental designs. So this study I described in Ecuador was where they actually had one group of children who didn't get an egg, and they had another group of children who did get the egg. But they were in the same socioeconomic status, they were the same age, they were in the same country. So all the other variables were taken care of. So because, as I said, if you're having a pizza, you're probably having a soft drink with it. So these are what we call confounding variables. And by having two control groups that are randomly allocated, those, in theory, if we have enough numbers in the groups, those confounding variables will basically cancel each other out.
Get it.
And then the only effective difference between the group is our actual intervention. So that's called an experimental design. And the best experimental design is what we call randomized control trial that's blinded.
Yep.
So blinded means that the researchers and occasionally the participants won't know which intervention they actually got. So you can do that with, a vitamin supplement, because you can give people an inert tablet and somebody gets a real one, and that's the absolute gold standard.
Yep.
And then we can take the level of evidence another step further with something called a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis basically says, look, you might, just by chance, if you do enough of these randomized controlled trials, it's just like flipping a coin, you might get 10 heads in a row, just by chance.
Got it.
Through probability. So a meta-analysis says, well, why don't we take all of the randomized controlled trials together and analyse them as one and see what the average result is, because we know that the more numbers there is, statistically, the more likely it is to represent a true finding.
Got it.
So I tend to place more weight in experimental designs and meta-analyses. Now, one of the problems with some of the meta-analyses is because we don't have a lot of experimental studies backing it up, they might do a meta-analysis on research that's been poorly done. And as you know, garbage in, garbage out. So you have to be careful when you do look at the meta-analysis of the type of studies which they were looking at.
Got it. Can I come back to the plant-based vegan diet? Is it possible to get all the nutrients you need for optimal health for the average punter?
No.
What are the big things that you miss by being on a vegan diet?
Well, the one that everybody knows about is vitamin B12.
Which you can't get unless you're having animal
protein.
You
cannot get unless you're having animal foods. Now, there's some people that talk about bacterial production way down in the colon and all of this, and that's basically garbage. Even if there were bacteria down inside your colon that could be producing B12, that's not where it's absorbed in the intestines. So you're basically going to excrete it. So you cannot have, by definition, a nutritionally complete vegan diet without supplementation. Now, vegetarian diet...
Supplementation in the form of oral or intravenous supplements?
It's either got to be, oral B12 or injectable B12. Now, on a vegetarian diet, because you are permitted some animal foods, then you do get higher amount. You can get some of these. But the vegan diet is absolutely impossible to be optimally healthy without extraneous supplementation. Then we come to other nutrients which we know, things like zinc and iron and copper, which are far higher concentration in animal foods than they are in plant foods. And it's not just the concentration of these nutrients that we need to be aware of, but also their form. For instance, the type of iron, so you've got heme and non-heme iron, the type of iron that you get in plant foods is very difficult for the body to absorb and to know what to do with compared to the iron that we have in meat. And that goes for, as I alluded to before with the omega-3s, the type of omega-3 that we get from plants is very hard for the body to know what to do with. Whereas what we call the marine omega-3, basically to reflect that it's a good quality DHA, the body's very easily able to assimilate that into its tissues. Then we also have a factor called anti-nutrients. And this sounds a little bit sci-fi.
Anti-nutrients.
But we've all heard about it. So there's a reason your doctor tells you not to drink tea when you have an iron supplement. If you're a vegetarian low in iron, the reason is because there's substances in the tea, like tannins and phytates, that will actually interfere with the absorption of the nutrients. So, for instance, we've done some studies looking at zinc absorption. And if you have a zinc-rich food, like oysters, and have some black beans at the same time, you will reduce your absorption of that zinc by more than 50%. So in effect, you're getting less than half of what you otherwise would have if you didn't have that food with the beans at the same time because of these anti-nutrient factors within the beans. So it becomes very, very difficult. So we all get hooked up on these recommended daily intakes and things like that. And really, they've been created with very poor science, and it doesn't necessarily reflect whether or not the micronutrient you're looking at is the most bioavailable form, and it certainly doesn't take into account what you're consuming it with. That concurrent consumption of these anti-nutrient substances will then impair the end nutrient result that you're getting from that. And that's not even including the deleterious effect that certain substances in plants, such as lectins or glutens, these other type of proteins, that they actually are known to cause harm to us, to humans. So there's a lot of moving parts.
There is, but it's, and I don't think there's ever been a point in time in the history of man where more people are convinced that the best thing for their own health and the health of the planet is a plant-based diet. And I can only assume it's because the plant-based movement and the climate change movement that quite often has hidden agendas and quite often has big corporations behind it have just been very good at spreading their message. Propaganda is probably a word I'd prefer to use, but let's call it spreading their message. How can we get the science so wrong? And I do want to talk about the other side of the ledger in a minute, and maybe we're starting to have more influences on the omnivore, carnivore side of it. But in your view, why do you think that so many people are misguided in believing that they're doing the right thing for themselves and the planet by eating a plant-based diet?
I think it's a simple and an instinctive message. I also happen to think it's wrong. There's a couple of very appealing things. So we know that this whole business about the saturated fats in the diet being bad for us is just complete bunkum. But the logical extension of that, if you accept that premise, is that because plant foods are very low in saturated fats, plant foods ergo must be good for us. So we can make these type of leaps of faith. And there are studies out there that do appear to demonstrate that the plant-based diets are good for us, understanding that they've set a very low bar of comparing themselves to junk food-rich carbohydrate-rich, processed food-rich diets.
Yeah.
So, I mean, basically, you could go out and, have a bowl of mud. That's going to beat the Australian diet, the average Australian diet. Then it comes this ethical issue as well. And instinctively, that is appealing for especially a lot of young people. And I can understand the appeal there, but I think there's also a lack of understanding that a true vegan diet does not exist without dead animals.
This is a conversation that I've had a couple of times with some really learned people around the fact that so many more animals are killed by plant-based agriculture than by animal-based agriculture, and we used an example recently. We had Joel Salatan, that amazing sustainable farmer, on the podcast a few weeks ago, around a farmer here in Australia that raises animals and raises crops and has done the study on how many animals die and the length and pain of their death through plant-based agriculture versus an animal that's part of the food chain and is raised and treated and has one bad nanosecond in its life. But again, it's a conversation that gets caught up in romantic views of Disney characters and that a cow's more valuable than a field mice or a bird or whatever it happens to be.
Well, let's look at it like this. So we know that plants come from soil and they draw all their nutrition and their sustenance from the soil in which they've grown. And yet if we don't fertilise the soil, then if you don't feed the soil, you won't grow anything. We know this. The soil will be depleted. Now, after World War II, when we had this boom in agriculture, this discovery of fossil fuels and how we could use the fossil fuels to make fertiliser, and we were growing. Now, think for a second, fossil fuel, dead animals.
Yeah.
We basically require, without death, there is no life.
Yep, agree fully.
Without biological matter that comes from things that have previously been in existence, our soil is barren. So in essence, there is no such thing as a vegan diet. And if you think there is, you are kidding yourself. And then it comes to the environmental effects. Every time you take a plough to a soil, you turn it over, you expose trillions of microbes to the elements, to the UV radiation of the sun. They get blown away. Every season that you plough a field, you deplete the topsoil. And it's been estimated that by 2020, we'll have depleted 50% of the topsoil that we've ever had.
By next year?
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
So, sure, we've still got a lot of topsoil to go, but what happens when that runs out? Now, so growing crops depletes this. Do you know what replenishes topsoil? Grazing ruminant animals.
Yeah.
Because they've got this remarkable ability. So grass, from the cellulose in grass, is basically produced through this remarkable process using the sun rays. Photosynthesis.
Yeah.
And then these cows, they can come and they can basically ferment that in their guts, and they'll have excrement that comes out the other end, and that will actually build topsoil. So whereas if you crop a land, you deplete the topsoil. If you graze a land with ruminants, you'll replenish that soil.
Particularly if it's rotational.
And people will also talk about the water use. It's almost like if a cow drinks some water that it doesn't come out the other end. It's not waste water. The cow is actually watering the fields for you via the urine. So these whole arguments, the zero-sum game about, cattle do this and they do that, they've actually been shown to lead to a sequestration of carbon. Actually, if you actually have a look at it and how much carbon actually gets sequestered in the soil from grazing, the running cattle is actually beneficial from a carbon balance perspective.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter which way you look at it. I mean, they're very appealing vegan arguments, but they're very easily dispatched. If you have a look at from an ethical perspective, then you can understand that, it's not, you don't have life without death, and it's just, you've got to be an adult, grow up and admit that there's no other way for you to thrive. It is impossible for you as a human to exist without there being death on some level.
Yeah.
If you have a look at it from an environmental perspective, we've just had the wool pulled over our eyes. If you have a look at it from a nutritional perspective, again, we've been misled.
Yeah.
So whichever way you look at it, I don't believe that a vegan diet stacks up.
There's another, and this isn't meant to be a vegan bashing exercise, because I will always say this. I respect people's choices to do whatever they want, but to your point about ethical decisions, that one of the big things that most vegetarians and vegans don't want to acknowledge is for them to live on a plant-based diet. The only way we can get, and let's use Australia as an example, since we're sitting here in Sydney, the only way for them to eat that plant-based diet year-round is for us to import from other countries, typically third world countries that can't afford to give up that food, where most of the malnourishment, the 2 billion people in the world that are currently living malnourished, comes from. And so if you want to talk about ethics, then you need to expand your understanding of how this whole food chain works.
Yeah.
And that importing avocados from Brazil so that we can eat them for $15 a pop down in Bondi doesn't make you an ethically right person.
That's true. I couldn't agree more.
Yep. I do want to talk about, because for the first time in a decade I can remember, the whole, and let's go to the extreme, because this carnivore movement that people like Sean Baker and Jordan Peterson and some other well-known, call them influencers around the globe, you know, and I can't quite understand how anyone can just live on meat, but I don't want to pass judgment on that. It just doesn't seem intuitively right to me. But what is the truth about red meat? And you spoke about some of the incredible deficiencies from having a plant-based diet. So I can only assume that the flip side of that is that you're getting that from eating ethically grazed and harvested, predominantly plant-fed beef and other animal produce.
Yeah.
What are some of the real truths about red meat in particular that we should talk about?
Well, I think one of the myths is that red meat can be nutritionally deficient. The first one that most dietitians I speak to will say, what about vitamin C?
It's full of vitamin C, isn't it?
Well, that's a very interesting thing. So in the classical teaching is that there is no vitamin C in meat.
Or carbohydrate for that
and
matter.
Yet, but if you actually have a look at some of the food tables, and this was elegantly pointed out by Amber O'Hearn,
Who's Amber O'Hearn?
Amber O'Hearn, she's one of the prominent carnivores. She arranged Carnivore in Boulder in Colorado earlier this year. She's a very, very astute and bright lady. Now, she went and had a look at some of these food tables that listed vitamin C content of meat as being 0, and they just had a little number. It might have been 6 or 7 beside it in subscript. And she went down and had a look at that, and it said assumed 0. They didn't even calculate it. They were so confident in their own opinion that there was no vitamin C in meat, they'll just put it in the table, put it in the medical literature for posterity. And yet we know there is vitamin C in meat. So in the Napoleonic Wars, when they used to have scurvy, they used to use the raw horse meat from the horses that were killed in battle to cure scurvy. It's been long known historically, and this has been known for almost 200 years, that meat has been described as an antiscorbutic. It's basically an agent that will cure scurvy. So there is absolutely no truth to the statement that there's not sufficient vitamin C in meat. Now, some people will point out and say, well, the quantities in meat is so far below what the RDI is. Well, the recommended daily intake is based on a carbohydrate-intensive diet. So glucose actually competes with vitamin C for uptake. So if you're not putting all this sugar into your body, then you actually will absorb a higher fraction. And there's also vitamin C is also used to produce something called carnitine, which is a molecule involved in fat metabolism. Now, the CARN, the first 4 letters, now this is the Latin root for flesh. So carnitine is only found in meat. And if you don't eat meat, then you're not ingesting this. You have a much greater need for vitamin C to help your body synthesize this. But if you are eating lots of meat, then that actually will have a vitamin C sparing effect. You're not using your vitamin C as much for this purpose. So there's several mechanisms by which on a low carbohydrate diet that includes meat, your vitamin C needs will actually be much less, and almost certainly the vitamin C content in your diet will be sufficient for your needs.
What are some of the other big ones that are found in, and let's continue with just red meat because, again, it is the most nutritionally dense, but what are the big things that you're getting from red meat?
Well, the big one, iron, is an obvious one.
It is an obvious one that everyone knows, yeah. D?
Well, yeah, you can get a little bit of vitamin D. Interestingly, I believe there's a difference between whether it's been raised in a feedlot or not. So I think it was in about 1970 when they discovered vitamin D as a nutrient, and that was actually what then allowed them to start doing the feedlots, because they could then start injecting the cattle with it because they weren't necessarily getting it from their environment in the same way.
Because the feedlots were not in the sunshine? Or?
Look, I'm not sure if it's a sunshine thing or if it's a from the grass, but I do know that historically feedlot without giving them vitamin D, it's cattle in feedlots do need vitamin D.
Ds, yeah.
Now, one of the other interesting extensions on that is there's another vitamin called vitamin K2, which is essential for metabolic health. It actually helps us, it reduces calcification in our blood vessels. It actually helps us put calcium into our bones. It improves our bone mineral density. And my understanding is that on grass-fed and pasture-raised cattle, there's a very nice level of vitamin K2, but it's likely to be much lower in feedlot-raised cattle.
Yeah, get it. Do you honestly think that you can live in optimal health on a pure carnivore diet?
Look, I have
to say... It is
say,
extreme. I get it's extreme, but there seems to be people that are doing it, and it's just anecdotal evidence, but that seem to look... And what's the guy's name that... Aaron McKenzie. I was watching some of his things. Is he a carnivore?
From what I understand, yes.
The guy is freakishly talented, healthy, agile. Is that just because he's got good genetics, or is part of that?
I have to say, I haven't seen any research that would convince me it's not possible to be extremely healthy on carnivore. I do know several people personally who are carnivores who appear to be in very, very good health.
Were they not in good health before when they were on a SAD diet?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and I've actually got several patients who are carnivores and who have actually reversed chronic health issues by going carnivore. And I mean, some people will say the jury is out because we haven't got long-term studies on them. We do have population evidence. We look at the Maasai and the Inuit and other historical cultures which were often predominantly animal products, very, very little foraging. And so the historical data would certainly suggest that it's possible to be very, very healthy on an animal-based diet with minimal, if any, plant food.
Interesting. I want to talk about some of the things that most people have heard over the years. Red meat's bad for cholesterol, heart disease, etc. Cholesterol's a big one, and I had personal experience recently with a doctor that I respect. I've been to her. She's a GP. She's a lovely human being, and as far as GPs go, she seems to be reasonably knowledgeable. But we had this conversation recently about my cholesterol is too high, and I said, explain more to me what you're testing, because I've got enough knowledge to be dangerous. And I was trying not to be insulting because I really like this woman. And as I say, she's a terrific doctor. She said, your LDL bad cholesterol is bad. And I'd been to see you 4 years ago. So again, I knew enough to be dangerous. I said, but what about the substrands? And it was probably not even the right terminology. Can you, and she didn't have an answer for it, so again, no disrespect, but I walked out of there saying, you know what, I need to talk to someone that's done a little bit more up-to-date research on that. Let's talk about cholesterol in terms of cholesterol in general, but also the correlation between meat consumption and cholesterol.
Well, I mean, cholesterol is a molecule that's essential for life. So first of all, if you actually ask the average doctor what cholesterol is, they will not be able to tell you. In medical school, I got through a whole medical degree and I did pretty well. I got honours. And I honestly could not have told you what cholesterol was at the end of it. I could tell you I could use a nomenclature. I could say HDL, LDL ratios, ApoA1, ApoB, etc. I could talk the talk, but I honestly didn't have a good conceptual understanding of what it was. So let's talk about what is cholesterol. It's a small molecule. It is essential for life. Every cell has it. It's so important that if you don't eat it, the body will make it. If you do not have any cholesterol, you will die. So that's what cholesterol is. Now, what doctors call cholesterol are very complex particles. Think of them like a submarine that circles around inside your blood, and they carry cholesterol inside. Now, if you've ever poured some water inside a frying pan that's got a bit of fat in it, you'll see how the fat forms globules. Yeah. So fat, that's what fat does. And fat can't move around the circulation as a globule. It's got to be broken up into smaller particles. So this is why we need these particles, and we call them lipoproteins, which will actually carry the cholesterol around the body. Now, the one that we talk about as being dangerous is called an LDL, a low-density lipoprotein. Now, for some reason, I'll tell you why, we associate high levels of LDL with heart disease. And this comes back to a guy called Ansel Keys, and he developed what he called the lipid heart hypothesis. And he postulated that higher levels of saturated fat in the body could actually then lead to deposition inside the arteries. And his model was developed from rabbits, an herbivore, an animal which has absolutely no capacity for protein and fats in their diet. So what did they feed these rabbits? Well, saturated fat, and they fed them saturated fat, and somehow they thought that you could translate an herbivore's experience and physiology to a human. So it's basically utterly bad science. Yep. But if you subscribe to this theory that saturated fat is then bad, we also have made the observation that saturated fat can increase the amount of circulating LDL. So if you accept the premise saturated fat is bad, then you must also accept the premise that LDL, high levels of LDL, is also bad. Now, unfortunately, the very first premise was wrong, so the second premise is also wrong. And the most recent meta-analysis that looked at 19 separate studies looking at all-cause mortality, so your chance of dying and your LDL levels, they actually found in 16 of them that there was an inverse relationship. That is, the higher your LDL level, the longer you lived. Okay. So, I mean, if that doesn't...
I live a long time.
If that doesn't immediately make you suspicious of our fear of LDL, then I don't know what will. But we still do know that LDL does end up lining the blood vessels. And I'll tell you what happens there. It's when LDL gets damaged, and it can be damaged in two ways. It can be damaged through a process called glycation, where sugar attaches to it. And it can be damaged through a process called oxidation, which is to do with electrons in valence. It's basically, think of it like rusting of a molecule. It's a bit of a loose description. But it can be oxidized, or it can be glycated or damaged by sugar. So what does that mean? So if these things lead to LDL clogging your blood vessels, that means high blood sugar is bad and high oxidative stress is bad. What gives you high blood glucose? Well, carbohydrates are made of glucose. So therefore, eating high carbohydrate diets is what actually will turn your LDL bad. And oxidative stress, number of contributing factors in our modern lifestyles, but a big one is the omega-6 fats, vegetable and seed oils. So simply put, if you want to make sure that your LDL population remains healthy and is going to make sure that you're in that population who lives longer with a high LDL, don't have excessive amounts of vegetable and seed oils, and don't have excessive amounts of carbohydrate.
Yeah.
That will keep you having a healthy cholesterol.
Yeah, interesting. I think this, for a lot of people, is exciting, liberating, perhaps a little bit agitating. What tests should people be doing? Because again, this is one of my fundamental, it's the reason why I just don't go to the doctor anymore. I just went this year because my dad's a doctor and he said, you got to get a checkup, you're 50. And I said, Dad, you're a stubborn old prick, I'll just go and get it. But you go in and you get cholesterol done, and we won't go back down that rabbit hole.
Well, we can. Well, let's talk about, if you're worried about your cholesterol,
yeah.
And if you want to know, do you have this damaged LDL? So we actually call that small dents, because when it gets glycated and oxidized, it actually gets a fraction smaller.
Yeah.
We can do a fancy test to measure that. That costs $120. It has to be sent to one of the research laboratories. However, we can get a proxy of that looking at something called your HDL and your triglyceride ratio. Now, triglycerides are actually produced in the liver predominantly when you have excessive carbohydrate. So triglyceride is a very good marker of excess carbohydrate, and we know that it's excess carbohydrate that damages your LDL. And the data shows that if we have a look at the ratio between your triglyceride and your HDL, that will be a far better predictor of your chance of dropping off the perch than we're looking at your LDL level. So triglyceride to HDL ratio would be something very good. There's another test called the HbA1c, and this is a test. So if you visualize that inside your blood vessels, you've got the pipe, you've got your blood cells, they're sort of like a UFO, or like a donut shaped, floating around, and you've also got molecules of sugar going around. So remember the term blood glucose level. So there is sugar in the blood. Now, these glucose molecules can passively attach to the blood cells. Now, this just happens based on the concentration of the sugar and how long it's been in contact. So if we understand that the average lifespan of a red blood cell is 120 odd days, then we can actually take a red blood cell, have a look at how much sugar is attached to it, and that can give us a rough guide for what your average blood sugar level is. So, and this average blood sugar is a very good indicator of your risk of heart disease, far better than almost any other blood test we can do. And why is it such a good indicator? Why does it have such strong predictive value? Because the problem causing a lot of this is high levels of carbohydrates. So HbA1c is certainly a good one. And there's a bunch of other inflammatory markers, but if I had to pick two, if you're worried about heart disease, simple blood tests that are very easily available,
Go and do it.
Triglyceride, HDL, and HbA1c.
What are some of the others, though, Paul? Because assume that there are a bunch of people that are listening to this that really do want to be able to measure their improvement. If I'm going to go down this path of having better health, then let's measure it. What are some of the other tests they should be doing, and can they get them done at their GP, or do they need to come to a specialist like you to really understand what's going on under the hood?
Look, most GPs will do these as standard. The question is, do they truly understand what the results mean?
Well, that's no. I think that's a given. For no disrespect, for the vast majority of GPs, they don't understand it.
I think one of the problems is that when the blood tests come out, down the right-hand side of the page, we have what's called a reference range. And basically that is a 95% confidence interval in most cases, where 95% of the population will be expected to fall within that result. And the result is only flagged as being abnormal if it falls outside that level. Now, here's the problem. Do you think 95% of the population is healthy?
Of course not.
These values do not reflect optimal health. They don't even reflect, mediocre health a lot of the time. They just reflect a statistical marker. So, and a lot of doctors are interpreting the blood results based on these reference ranges. So that's where the first problem is. Let's take, for example, a marker of liver damage. So imagine that you've got a liver cell. It's like a ball. And you've got certain chemicals inside that, enzymes, that are not really found in high concentration in other tissues. Now, if that liver cell gets sick and bursts open, that will release its content into the plasma. We can do a blood test and we can detect it. So one of these markers is called ALT. That's the abbreviation we often use, and it's well known as a liver enzyme. And if that level is particularly high, that suggests liver damage. And this whole pathology of metabolic disease is central to the liver. So this is another very good marker of metabolic health. So what happened over the last 30 years as the population got healthier? Well, this reference range, it used to have an upper limit of about 20. And it used to, when everybody was skinny and healthy, and if you were over 20, you would say, "Oh."
How long ago was that? Like 50 years?
Probably 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And over time, that has just gradually increased. So now for females, most females, the upper limit is set at 30. And for some labs, the upper limit for males is set at 40. So you can be, simply because the population has gotten less healthy, rather than say, well, diagnose every second person with fatty liver, we just move the goalposts. So I guess to go back to your original point about what blood tests to do, so these liver enzymes are very good to assess metabolic health, but you have to understand the context in which they're interpreted. Do not interpret them in the context of the population, interpret them in the context of what is optimal health.
Optimal health, yeah, it's a good one. Anything else they should be testing?
Inflammatory markers. I mean,
homocysteine.
I do a large number of blood tests depending on what I find when I examine the patient and take a history. So I guess I've probably talked about the main ones, but there is a whole lot of secondary ones, and homocysteine is certainly one. Homocysteine reflects malabsorption state. So if you're not absorbing nutrients effectively, this could be B2, B6, B12, folate, your homocysteine level will rise. Now, for most reference ranges, it's considered normal if it's under 12, or some reference ranges even under 15. But the data very clearly shows your risk of dying goes up when it's over 9. So I actually use elevated homocysteine as a marker of malabsorption, which is often secondary to intestinal inflammation. So if I go back a step, when you ingest a nutrient, it goes into your mouth and ends up going through your stomach and into your intestines. There it's broken down into small parts, and then it will cross the wall of the intestine where it can be absorbed into the body. Now, if you have inflammation or dysfunction in the intestinal wall, then perhaps you're not going to be able to absorb all of these nutrients. And this is very interesting. I mentioned before, very early on in our chat, about lectins and gluten.
Yeah.
This is where some of these proteins, which are found in plant-based foods, they can actually cause intestinal inflammation. So if I see somebody with an elevated homocysteine that's outside of optimal, I'll then often go and do some testing for something called antibodies, which is an autoimmune disease. Now, an autoimmune disease, I know we're going into the weeds a little bit here.
The weeds are good, man.
An autoimmune disease is when your body starts attacking itself. So if you get an infection, let's say, you go outside and little kid sneezes in your face, which is usually what happens when I go home. Your body will see this virus and it will say, you're not part of me, you're foreign, and it will mount what's called an immune response against it. And as a part of that immune response, you can have things called antibodies. They're like little guided missiles. And they're little personal assassins for that virus. It will go and it will attack that virus and knock it out. Now, occasionally, you can have this immune response go rogue. And rather than create antibodies that will target parasites, bacteria, viruses, they might actually target your own healthy cells. And there's very good evidence that these proteins that are predominantly found in plant foods called lectins can trigger autoimmune responses through something called molecular mimicry, which we can talk about in a moment. And then once you have this autoimmune response going on, it might attack your thyroid. So I can actually do a blood test and look for antibodies against your thyroid. It might lead to celiac disease. So there's some antibodies we look that provide us evidence of celiac disease. It might be affecting your pancreas and autoimmune diabetes, like type 1 diabetes. It could be affecting your joints, of rheumatoid arthritis. So there's a myriad of different antibodies that we can test for, and I'll usually base my selection of those antibodies based on somebody's symptoms. Do they have joint pain? Do they have abdominal symptoms? Do they have troubles with insulin resistance, etc., etc.? But I'll just backtrack now and talk about this molecular mimicry concept, because it does sound quite foreign. So when the immune system targets a bacteria, it doesn't actually look at the whole bacteria. It just looks at, I guess, a molecular signature, a short sequence of amino acids or proteins or carbohydrates, or a short sequence of molecules on the coat. And if it identifies, let's say that it might be a series of random letters, A, C, E. Now, if you ingest a carbohydrate binding protein that has on part of it the same sequence of letters, A, C, E, and that's able to trigger an immune response because your body says, well, this is foreign, then these antibodies that are developed to target this ingested, what we call a lectin, a carbohydrate binding protein, they can also recognise the same molecular moiety on your cells. That's what we call molecular mimicry. Your immune system is just confused. And I've had a lot of success in clinic where we have people with these just low-grade nutrient malabsorption. They've got circulating antibodies against their thyroid. So a condition called Hashimoto's thyroiditis is very, very common. And probably if we test people up into their 60s and 70s, more than 50% of people at that age would probably have evidence of some antibodies being developed against their thyroid. And that leads to lethargy, fatigue, malabsorption of nutrients, because it's also associated with gut inflammation. And when we eliminate some of these foods that have the highest concentration of these problematic lectins, their symptoms usually improve dramatically.
It's a really interesting point. My father-in-law, who's 60, 61, thin, active guy, but chronic knee problems, vegetarian, not vegan, but largely vegetarian. And I've been for a long time, he's listened to Duran and different things. Do you think that there is potential that, and energy-wise too, I think, just struggles in general for a guy that is ostensibly quite healthy and has all the other things, sleeps well, good family, good weight levels, all those kinds of things. Do you think that the potential that lectins or other things in plants and the absence of some of the critical proteins and things in animals could really help him?
So, yeah, there's probably three main mechanisms which come up with regards to connective tissue health with diet. So I just want to talk quickly about bone health and protein for a moment. So I don't know if you know much about osteoporosis, but conventional teaching is that when you have weak bones, reduced density, there's nothing we can do about it. We can slow the decline, but we can't actually reverse it. So bone is made up predominantly of two things, calcium, and one thing that people don't realise is protein. So basically bone is mineralised tendon, or it's mineralized protein. So if the body needs calcium, the calcium is stored in the bone. So the body will actually break down some of this protein matrix to get at the calcium and release it. So if you give somebody lots of calcium and lots of vitamin D, you actually reduce their need to break down more bone. And this is what the studies very clearly show. They show that when we supplement with calcium and vitamin D, we can slow down the decline in osteoporosis. Now, there was one very clever randomized controlled trial where at the end of it they said, we collected all this dietary data as well. Why don't we analyse the results based on protein intake? And this study was done in postmenopausal females and males over the age of 65. So the population that is considered that it's the most difficult population to deal with osteoporosis. You can't really even help it with medication. And they found that over 3 years, using DEXA scanning, which is a gold standard for diagnosing bone mineral density, they were able to reverse the loss of bone mineral density in the group that was having the highest amount of animal protein. So protein and connective tissue health is an absolute no-brainer. Now, and this is well in excess of the recommended daily intake. Yeah. So the recommended daily intake of protein was calculated in college-aged males only thinking about the structural need for protein. Basically, they were thinking, well, protein is used to build stuff, so we'll calculate how much stuff you're building and that will be how much protein you need. But protein also does other things. It's also involved in enzymatic processes and enzymes and things like that. So already you can see that you've missed out on one of the big dietary needs for protein. So probably for optimal health, you need to double that recommended daily intake for protein. Now, just to go back to your question about more specifically about knee pain and if there's the dietary components of that. So going back to lectins, so we know that some people, and certainly people with rheumatoid arthritis, there's studies when they cut wheat out of their diet, they get better. So one of these lectins that is problematic is called wheat germ agglutinin. And that can actually bind to something called glucosamine. So glucose, a sugar thing. So these lectins are carbohydrate binding proteins. So they bind to carbohydrates. And remember, sugar is a carbohydrate. So glucosamine can actually bind to the wheat germ agglutinin. Yeah. Now, if you take glucosamine at the same time that you're eating wheat, it can bind in your intestine, the hollow of your intestine, what we call the intestinal lumen, before it gets absorbed into your system. And this explains why there's so many people around the world that swear that glucosamine helps their joint pain. And yet when we study it, we don't see any benefit. And the reason we don't see any benefit is that the people who are getting benefit from glucosamine have an inflammatory joint pain. And the people who we study, by definition, we say, oh, it must help osteoarthritis. We require you to have osteoarthritis that's proven on a knee x-ray. So basically, we exclude the people with inflammatory pain for our study, and we only have the people with arthritis. And then we wonder why there's no clear evidence that it works. And yet, every orthopedic doctor, every surgeon, every sports doctor you ever speak to will tell you that they've got dozens and dozens of patients who swear that the glucosamine helps their symptoms. And that's the mechanism that the glucosamine helps. It actually binds to this lectin, the wheat germ agglutinin, and stops it from having an inflammatory effect. So if you're, have a relative on a vegetarian or a vegan-style diet with lots of wheat who's having inflammatory knee pain, you could do worse than giving a trial of glucosamine.
As a supplement or through...
As a supplement.
Yeah.
You just get it from a health food store. Obviously...
What about bioavailability and things like that? Because it seems like it's...
You don't need to absorb it. The whole point is that it binds to...
Okay.
It binds... It doesn't matter what happens inside your body. Yeah. It's not being incorporated into the cartilage or anything like that we used to think. All it does is it binds to this other deleterious molecule before that can be absorbed.
Get it.
Now, the other thing is that you can... fatty liver will actually lead to weaker connective tissue. So all our connective tissue in the body, it's... imagine you've got a cell, and each cell is responsible for what we call an extracellular matrix. It's basically a sphere of scaffolding around it. Bone is like this, tendons, ligaments, every tissue we have, it's basically a nucleus in a cell, and then you have this zone of connective tissue. Now, this connective tissue or extracellular matrix is constantly remodeling, breaking down a little bit, reforming a little bit. Now, there's some circulating enzymes called matrix metalloproteinases, and they are the only enzyme in the body that can actually break this extracellular matrix down. So if you have higher levels of these circulating matrix metalloproteinases, you're basically leading to a softening or a weakening of the connective tissue. And they're produced from the liver. And when you get a fatty liver, they're produced in much, much higher concentrations. And this is why, so especially when we see pain from arthritis where the cartilage is already thinned out. So if you've lost a lot of your cartilage, you want the cartilage that's left to be as strong and resilient as possible. So you really want to have a low amount of these matrix metalloproteinases. And fortunately, when you lose just a small amount of body weight, it usually comes from the liver first. It usually corrects fatty liver quite early on in the piece, and then your liver stops secreting the same volume of these matrix metalloproteinases. And then that means that this you don't have this softening effect on your connective tissues anymore. And that's why a very moderate reduction in body weight. So somebody might lose, on average, 10% of their body weight, and the data shows that their pain will reduce by 30 to 50%.
Yeah, wow.
And this is
10%'s a lot, though.
Well, 10%'s
I suppose
a lot.
depending how heavy you are.
But
like if you lost 10% of your weight, you'd be...
Well, I'm about 80 kilos.
Yeah, so 10% is takes you down to the low 70s.
Yeah. I mean, but that's a reasonable, and we're talking about people who are obese. But if you have somebody who's 150 kilograms,
losing 15 is not
and
a lot,
they go down to 135 kilograms,
makes a quantum difference.
They're still very, very overweight.
Yeah.
So clearly, it's the benefit on their knee pain is not mechanical predominantly. It's these inflammatory effects and these systemic effects of these matrix metalloproteinases. And it's just for me, it's fascinating how you could, get such a dramatic reduction. And we didn't understand it for a long time. And it was only when we figured out the pieces that the liver makes this enzyme, and the liver is the first thing that actually loses fat when you lose weight. So this is why if you lose 10% of your body weight, you still might be technically obese, but you can be metabolically healthy. In the same way that we also have the other flip of the coin, what we call TOFI, which is thin on the outside and fat on the inside.
Yeah.
So you see, you go down to a park run on the weekend, and how many of these guys are exercising a lot and they've all got that pot belly? These middle-aged guys with that little pot belly, they're exercising, they're trying to do everything they can. I promise you they've got fat in the wrong place.
Yeah.
Around their liver.
Yeah. How important is fasting from an optimal health perspective, or is it a little bit of a fad that seems to be getting as much airplay as the plant-based movement?
I think fasting is very helpful if you're metabolically unhealthy. So if you have if you're having an unhealthy diet, if you're eating crap food, you'll get health benefits by eating that in a time-restricted fashion. By giving your body a little bit of a fast and giving your body a break from sustained elevation of insulin levels and these circulating fatty acids that are produced after a carbohydrate-rich meal.
Yeah.
And there's very good evidence that, that time-restricted eating, which is, maybe eating in a 6-hour window, or intermittent fasting, that they're very similar conceptually, but there are some differences between them. Either and or will lead to metabolic improvements for the exact same macronutrient intake. So you change nothing, you just eat it in a shorter window. Exactly. For both metabolically healthy and unhealthy, but particularly for metabolically unhealthy? I think I don't fast.
At all?
I eat usually 1 to 2 meals a day. I don't consciously fast.
So what times do you eat then?
Whenever I'm hungry.
Yeah. So you're not necessarily having this 14 to 16 hour window a day?
No, I don't believe – I'm a bit of a hedonist.
Yeah.
If I'm hungry, I'd like to eat.
Sure.
What
about your mate Daron Scher that loves this stuff?
Well, he's just recently done a 3-day fast.
Yeah, we all partook. Some of my guys almost jumped off the bridge. One guy said I almost lost my wife and my job. I became so fucking cranky.
And if you try and do something like that and you're not fat adapted, so what happens
He definitely wasn't fat adapted.
When you start a ketogenic diet, it takes a while for the cellular machinery for your body to start breaking this fat down. You basically will starve your brain of any fuel source.
So you can't. That's a really interesting thing I hadn't thought of. So he literally, because he probably wasn't efficient to use his ketones, his brain was starving, so he was both not able to think and was super angry.
So angry.
He was angry, man. He was hysterical.
So, I mean, for me, I think if people aren't prepared to go on a very low-carb diet or an optimally healthy diet, then intermittent fasting is a way to make their diet healthier without changing much else. If you're on a particularly healthy diet, and I think I'm on a healthy diet, then For me personally, I'm yet to be convinced of all these benefits of mitochondrial biogenesis and autophagy and all of this. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I haven't been swayed by it myself yet.
Yeah. There's definitely some psychological benefits, I think, too. Just learning to be a little bit uncomfortable. It's my own personal view that we've got a society that they get a cold and they take a pill, they get a sore knee, they take an anti-inflammatory, they don't like their job for a day, they change their job. That learning to be uncomfortable is a psychologically healthy thing as a society.
Well, I think there's probably a lot there that we could introduce into the schools.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell me, you do spend a lot of time with some professional athletes, some Olympic athletes and things. They have you got a protocol, or do you really adopt this N=1 approach to optimal nutrition?
Look, it depends on the sport they're doing. I mean, it's all very logical. So
let's take the rowers, the Australian rowing team that you've been working with.
Probably can't talk specifically about the rowers,
no? Okay,
I'm afraid.
Sorry. Confidential. We want them to win at the Olympics. Let's talk more broadly then.
But yeah, I'm more on the rowing team for my medical.
Rather than nutrition. Okay.
Yeah, but look, if you pick is it an explosive event athlete or is it an endurance athlete? Actually, I can probably talk about one guy because I believe he's gone on public record on Twitter and a few other things as mentioning himself as a patient, and that's Pete Jacob. Mm-hmm. So he won the Hawaiian Ironman back in 2012.
Yeah, wow.
So he's no slouch.
The most grueling event on the planet, arguably, yeah.
So he's currently on a very low plant food diet at the moment, and he's actually just he's winding up to compete next year.
At Hawaii again? At
Hawaii, yeah. So he's basically thought he'll have another crack at it. So he had his own personal reasons for going to a heavy animal-based diet, and it's certainly working for him. And where he's at with his training, he's certainly done a lot of experimentation with, do you have fatty meat, do you not have fatty meat, et cetera, et cetera. He had a very interesting experience recently, actually. This is a little bit tangential, where he had a lot of aged foods and aged meats. And this is a bit of a cultural thing we like to, especially in Australia.
We might have to sponsor his Hawaiian Ironman campaign.
I would think he would absolutely reach out to him.
I will.
I'll put you in contact with him.
We're the aged meat specialist, man.
Well, unfortunately, the aged meats caused him a bit of a problem.
Oh, really? What happened?
Well, when you age meat,
reassess his sponsorship.
When you age meat, there's bacteria naturally in the environment that can metabolize an amino acid called histidine and produce what's called a biogenic amine called histamine. Now, this is just a fancy way of saying biogenic just means it acts on the body, and amine is just referring to its chemical molecular structure. And that can actually cause symptoms in some people who are very sensitive. Usually perhaps a little bit of diarrhea or a bit of nausea. So histamines are released when the body has an allergic response. So some of the symptoms that people who are intolerant of meat, and there are a couple of people out there that don't go so well with meat, it's quite possibly because they're having meat that's been too aged. And if they have meat that hasn't been aged and it's sort of frozen soon after harvest, as you would, then the freezing can stop the histamine formation. And I've not met anybody who's had an intolerance to the so-called fresher meat. But that's certainly very interesting. I get my meats from a family farm, actually. Yeah. And they actually, they don't hang my meat at all.
Interesting.
Which is, I know...
All plant-based? Sorry, all plant-fed, grass-fed?
Oh, yeah. So it's actually Bandera Farms.
Yeah.
So they total pasture. They don't grain feed. They refuse to use weed killers. They go out there picking all their weeds by hand.
Amazing.
We've
got some farmers like that we use. They're incredible.
When it comes to slaughter, they actually, they really care about their animals. They take the animal to the abattoir. They make sure it's not standing in the yard for long. It's basically straight in for slaughter. They do everything they can. I mean, I'll tell you a funny story. This is how crazy they are. They got some horse coats and they wondered what would happen. I mean, they got a herd of, 100 Angus or something like this, and they bought horse blankets because they thought, I wonder if they'll work for the cattle as well, and we'll try and do that. So they spent one season putting in, everybody, all the other farmers thought they were absolutely bonkers. And they were putting these horse blankets all over their cattle.
Well, maybe it helps them fatten up.
They actually did find that. So, yeah. So the lady's name is Linda O'Neill, and so they've recently rebranded. I don't know, they used to be Kersey Cattle or something, and now they're Bunderra Meats. But they actually found that they actually put on more weight when they had the blankets on. That's incredible.
You should introduce her to, and I don't know them off the top of my head, but we have this amazing association with an on-farm processing site that, again, trying to eliminate the stress that the animal undergoes from transport from farm to the slaughterhouse, and they're having some incredible results. And so far as how much cortisol and things are in the body when they're slaughtered. So that service is now available in parts of Australia, and for some, particularly these boutique ethical farmers, it's a really good option for them. So you should connect those two.
And I think this is probably a really important conversation to be having too when we're talking about the ethics of certain diets, is that just because you eat meat doesn't mean that you don't care about the welfare of the animal. It doesn't mean. So I honestly believe that sustainably raised ruminant meat can be ethical and is more ethical than any other diet. And I guess this is my personal reason why I source my meat. And I eat a lot of meat. And I'm very comfortable with the decision to do that because I know how my meat is raised.
Yeah.
I know where it's from. I know the quality of it.
And you're prepared to pay for it.
And yeah, I mean, look, I've got a 350 litre deep freeze. So I actually, I get half a cow at a time.
Yeah. That's pretty cool.
So not everybody is that dedicated.
Yeah, but you are eating a lot. The influences in this industry, like I think there are a lot of people that are craving more information about this stuff, and no doubt will be incredibly appreciative of what you've shared today. How do they find you? How do they follow you? Like Low Carb Doctors is your website?
Yes, lowcarbdoctors.com.au.
which is a great resource. I've looked at that. What about on Instagram?
I'm on Instagram. I just haven't posted anything.
Really? Not one post?
I don't know, not one post yet. I did create an account though.
What the fuck's going on, man? This is 2020.
Yeah, so I've been told that Twitter is outdated, and that puts me in the older generation already.
Well, Twitter's the water cooler of the digital age, man. It's just people sitting around chewing the fat. Yours is a very visual education process.
I was going to cross post, and then I got told that just wasn't cool.
Yeah.
So
okay, well we'll keep that.
Dr. Paul Mason on Twitter.
Yep. Okay, cool. The guys can find you there. Sean Baker's another guy that I know you respect a lot.
Yeah, so he does a podcast called the Human Performance Outliers podcast, HPO.
Needs a little bit of audio help. We're going to help him with that.
I think
get Louis onto it.
I think they just figured that out. But it was quite abominable for a while there.
Yeah, but great content.
Great content. Now, two other people who are in this space who are absolutely brilliant is Dr. Georgia Eade, EDE. Now, she's I think it was Harvard-trained psychiatrist, and she actually treats a lot of her patients with dietary management. She sort of no longer just looks at the human brain as a mix of chemicals subject to manipulation with drugs. And
she's a psychiatrist?
Psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And she's got some brilliant insights. And if you're looking at developmental psychology or the nutrient needs of the brain and a lot of this, she provides a really compelling argument about why a plant-based diet does not lead to optimal brain health.
Well, it was something I was going to ask you. Is there the risk that it goes the other way, that depression, anxiety, etc., may be aggravated by not having enough protein in your diet?
Well, it's not the protein, it's the iron. So there's a chemical in our brain called dopamine.
Yeah, the happy drug.
Yeah, the feel-good one.
Yeah.
The brain needs iron to make dopamine. Let that sink in for a moment.
And you can't take it as a supplement, because that's what people will say. I get.
Well, you can't take dopamine. No, you need.
No, you can't take iron as a supplement and have it bioavailable.
Well, you can take it as a supplement, but it's got a lot of side effects. Most of my patients will complain of constipation when we give iron tablets, and it doesn't get absorbed particularly well. And even if you are supplementing with lots of it, unfortunately, this intestinal inflammation, which is often triggered by gluten and these other things, will prevent you from absorbing iron, or it will lead to something we call functional sequestration. Now, this is
That's a good word.
Let me just, I had the dictionary out just before I came on.
Of course you did.
So let me just sort of elaborate on what this is. So as we've evolved over the eons, we haven't been exposed to autoimmune disease. The only thing that we've been worried about is infection. And so the predominant cause of inflammation in our bodies has only been infection. So when we've been inflamed, the response of the body is to say, hang on, there might be a bacteria around. The bacteria needs iron to proliferate. I'm going to lock my iron away so the bacteria can't use it. That will help me kill it.
Yeah.
And that is a very intelligent thing to do. Now, the problem is that while you're locking it away from the bacteria, you're locking it away from yourself. So you might have lots of iron in the body, but it's what was sequestered. It's stored in a molecule called ferritin. And when you're inflamed, your body just can't touch it. Now, if you have autoimmune inflammation, your body says, oh, we've got inflammation, we better lock our iron stores away. And this is then a counterproductive thing to do, because it means that this inflammation goes on for months and months and months. So you end up, your ferritin stores will be very, very high. The doctor will look at it and say, oh, you've got enough iron. But the trouble is you can't use it. It's called functional iron deficiency or latent iron deficiency.
Interesting.
So in that state, even if you are supplementing and trying to absorb it, if some of these plant-based foods are triggering an inflammatory response, that leads, you still can't use the iron. You're going to be deficient in dopamine, and no amount of tablets is going to help you out.
Yeah, wow. Dr. Georgia Eade, who was the other one you were going to mention?
Amber O'Hearn.
Amber O'Hearn. She's a doctor?
No, she's actually, I don't know if we can use the term citizen scientist, but she is, I believe she's a trained linguist, maybe a degree in Russian and mathematics, and she's just got a very analytical mind.
Yeah, interesting.
And she can look at a paper and call BS from 20 paces.
Yeah.
And she's, I really appreciate some of her analysis on some of the topics such as vitamin C in foods and things like that. So certainly worth a look at both their work.
Yep. And Gary Tubbs?
Yeah, so Gary Tubbs is, he probably broke the whole low-carb movement, over 10 years ago with his book, Good Calories, Bad Calories. If anybody's interested in just broaching the subject for the first time, you could do worse than read his book. He's certainly he's probably one of the doyens of the low-carb movement. He's probably not necessarily so prolific with regards to the plant versus animal debate. But certainly he understands metabolic disease and the role of carbohydrates and insulin as well as anybody in the world. Yeah,
amazing. And you've got a conference coming up, I believe.
Yeah, so we've got one in at Sydney University. I think it's coming up on Thursday. Let me just get this date. Thursday, the 10th of October. Gary Tubbs is actually going to be coming down, flying out from America to help us out there. Tickets can be at the website lowcarbdownunder.com.au. And that's if you're interested in the whole science of low carbohydrate, that would be well worth coming out and seeing an internationally respected lecturer.
Amazing. Paul, thanks for coming on the show, man. It's endlessly interesting, and we're going to do this a bunch more times.
I think so. Look forward to it.
Awesome, buddy.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, man.